And we're now going to jump forward in time a bit into the Holocene with our next speaker, Peter Hopcroft.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. All right, thanks. So I'm Peter Hopcroft. I guess you're going to hear this a lot. There's a bit of a change of tack from the previous few talks. Still looking at paleoclimate, but this talk is going to be about modeling and focusing on more recent time of the Holocene. I want to acknowledge my collaborators who are based at these approximate locations on the global satellite picture of world's forest there. So a couple of institutes in Sweden, in China, and in Calgary, Canada, and also in Bristol, as well as myself here in Birmingham. So I just thought I'd start putting what I'm going to say in a bit of context, I guess. So forests influence regional and global climate through a few, yeah, good point, through different mechanisms. One of the, and I've tried to sort of illustrate that here. So one of the obvious ones is albedo. So how reflective is the land surface? That's going to depend quite strongly on how dense the vegetation is, whether it's forest or here savanna or sort of more open land. The difference between the open and the forested surfaces is also going to have a huge influence on the moisture fluxes into the atmosphere, so evapotranspiration, and that will have an impact on the local conditions through the partitioning of latent and sensible heat, so the sort of the air conditioning effect effectively. Trees or their presence or absence also influences clouds through the release of water vapor, but also different compounds that can seep cloud particles. And then the roughness, the circulation around the surface will be altered by the presence of forests. And you can see that in the model experiment here. So this is not my work, but a paper by Baller et al. From a few years ago, looking at the global impact of global deforestation. So what would happen to the climate? All other things being equal. So you can see a cooling signal, which is mostly in the mid-latitudinal hemisphere, a bit more complicated elsewhere, or a bit more sort of smaller effects. But essentially, you can see all of those things I just mentioned coming into play. So an increase in albedo, decreases in evapotranspiration, particularly in the tropics, changes in cloud cover, and also in the resultant view of the atmosphere from above. So that all contributes to this kind of effect. So my talk's not about global deforestation, but about the Holocene. So I wanted to put that into context so you know what I'm talking about. So this is a figure that started off on Wikipedia, but it's ended up in this paper by Alan Hayward, Paul Valdez, and others. It's a global, a long history of Earth's climate, basically the last 450 million years. The colored lines are data, geological records of temperature. The black ones you can kind of ignore, but they're model simulations. The Holocene is started, or is defined to have started about 11,500 years ago, after the end of the Ice Age. And it's kind of, I guess, effectively turning into the Anthropocene. So we can kind of isolate it as this period from 11,000 years ago up until roughly the pre-industrial. Sorry, it's a bit pixely. And you can see also there's if we zoom in on the Holocene, some of these records. So the end grip is Greenland. It's showing a cooling signal over the last 10,000 years. Epica is kind of more balanced. The model simulations in black showing a warming. So there's kind of a bit of a debate as to what actually has been occurring with the climate. Admittedly, small signals, but was it cooling? Was it warming over this time period? In the rest of the talk, I'll be focusing on a couple of time slices, which I've just highlighted here. So the green one at 6,000 years ago is the mid-Holocene. So that's 6,000 years ago. And if I say kiloyear BP, I mean thousands of years before present. And then the blue one is the pre-industrial, so roughly 200 years ago. And I can put those on the slide that's been prepared by Jason and everyone else. So there's the mid-Holocene, 6,000. There's the pre-industrial, and here's the Holocene highlighted here. So how has forest area and climate changed during the Holocene? So Jason explained or showed us some of the basics of the Milankovitch cycles and the changes in Earth's orbit through time. And really through the Holocene, through the last 10,000 years, we're catching kind of one of those or half of one of those cycles. So over the last 10,000 years, we get an installation. One of the primary forcings of the climate is the change in insolation, and that's led to a decline in monsoons, so eradication of the Sahara. So you can see here, this is a cave painting from Tunisia, an area that's currently just barren desert, and about 8,000 years ago had all of these animals and people living there, and the first evidence of dairying is about 5,000 years ago in this area. So there's a kind of really profound transformation in the landscape there, driven by this change in Earth's orbit and the amount of sun that comes in different seasons, sunlight, sorry, not sun. There's a reduction in seasonality and cooling of the Arctic. So you can see these two maps here are showing you pollen samples, showing on the left, the present day, and on the right, 6,000 years ago, so the mid-Holocene again. You can see a shift. So the pink here is tundra, which has been replaced by forest in mid-Holocene in central Siberia. And over Northern Europe, there's a shift from coniferous forest to more cool temperate forest towards the Arctic Circle. And there's a variety of other things going on. There's a wetland of Central North America. But these things are essentially forced by primarily those Milankovitch cycles, a very small rise in carbon dioxide, and initially, in the early part of the Holocene, the retreat of the last of the ice sheets. But forest area may have changed additionally, not just due to the natural forcings, but also because of the presence of humans. So the Holocene is unique because of the kind of the spread of humans throughout basically the whole globe. And there's evidence of land use from almost the earliest Holocene, which I'm going to cover in the next few slides. So obviously this is a climate modeling talk. So how do we kind of bring those two themes together? And that's what I'm just going to try and cover in the next couple of slides. So one of the kind of established ways of estimating land use through time is to relate it to population somehow. So if we know how many people there were in different regions through time, and we know how much land those people were going to use or how much they did use, then we can sort of try to calculate their spatial footprint through time. So that's what this graph is kind of the start of. So this is land use per capita from 8,000 years ago to pre-industrial. And there's two sets of curves here. The brown one is what we call high. So this is a widely used scenario of land use. It's kind of, as you can see, got a very low footprint for each person on the Earth through time. Sorry. The other curves are based on more kind of a regional estimate with assumptions that when there's more land available, people would have used more of that land because of the restrictions on their kind of conflicts. And so you can see that these other curves have a much higher footprint per person. If you put those together and look at what it looks like in the mid-Holocene, you get these two contrasting images. So the thing I want you to remember is the KK10 is the top one with these kind of higher per capita estimates, and the Hyde is the much lower one from this on the bottom. So there's those two. There's also archaeological data. So this is a quite nice paper that came out a few years ago looking at a global compilation of archaeological findings and relating that essentially to land use in some way. And what you can see is in the archaeological data, there's pretty good evidence across much of Europe, Southeast Asia, fertile crescent for widespread sort of more than 20% fractional land use area from about 3, 4, 5,000 years ago. And that Hyde reconstruction just basically misses all of that. So you can see the onsets are all kind of dark blue. So they're kind of late in the last millennium. Whereas the archaeological data is pointing to a much earlier expansion of the sort of human footprint. So this kind of suggests that on the previous slide, maybe we should be looking more at this more intense scenario as being more realistic. There's also another line of evidence we can look at, which is pollen, and kind of developing methodology for taking pollen samples that look through time and converting them into an estimate of the regional land cover in a particular area. And this is based on this thing called reveals, which is some sort of acronym I can't remember all of the parts of, but the reveals method is what I'm going to call it. And it basically relies on understanding the relative productivity of pollen of different species and how that's going to essentially accumulate in a given fossil pollen record. And this is just an example from Europe showing you the sites and the kind of coverage that they've managed to build up. So this is the group in Sweden that I'm sort of collaborating with. But as you may realize, that kind of slightly patchy grid cell view of Europe isn't going to be much used for a climate model, which needs pretty much every grid cell. And so there's been kind of quite a long ongoing project with statisticians to turn that those point-based estimates into an interpolated field through a Bayesian hierarchical modeling strategy. I'm not going to go into any of the details of that, but suffice to say that they've essentially been able to condition a kind of full field on the original data, including uncertainty, for basically looking at the composition of the land surface based on the pollen. So is it unforested, broadleaf, or coniferous? So now we can compare all of these different estimates. So this is the change in open land for the mid-Holocene, so 6,000 years ago, in the KK10. So that's the really intense population-based estimate. The Hyde, which is the low intensity population-based estimate. And this is the uncertainty range from the pollen, so the reveals, mean, min, and max. And I should say that so for the reveals, we only really have data from North America, Europe, and China. Other areas of the globe are currently, we just don't have enough data. But you can see already that there's some agreement between the data sets and some quite major differences, particularly over so North America. So the reveal. So I should say these are all showing less open land generally back in the Holocene. So a kind of signature of increased land use and deforestation towards the present day. But there are some reversals to that trend in the reveals data for Central and North America, for example. But they all seem to agree on some of the other main signals. So there's more open land today than there was 6,000 years ago in Europe. But the intensity does vary between the reconstructions. So what I've done is put these scenarios into a climate model and run it through the Holocene for the last 10,000 years. And then we can compare the impact on the climate. So these are quite expensive simulations. They take quite a few months to run. And thankfully, they've just recently all finished. So here is the result for a few variables, just to give you an idea. So this is European summer surface air temperature anomaly relative to the pre-industrial in 5 simulations. So each curve is one transient Holocene simulation. So the first one in black has no land use. So it's showing you the impact of all of those natural forcings. So the insolation change due to Mankiewicz cycles, the slightly rising CO2, and so on. And you can see it's doing what we'd expect. It's showing a slight cooling as the insolation in the summer declines in the northern hemisphere. But you can see that as we add in land use, we get quite an amplified signal, especially with in the red curve, which is the more intense population-based estimate. We actually more than double that signal. It's nearly it's nearly 3 degrees warmer in the summer at the start of this simulation than in the simulation without any land use change. So it's potentially a really big signal, at least in Europe for this season. And we get a similar picture over China, albeit slightly smaller magnitude. So you can see that potentially land use has this really quite big effect in some areas, especially Europe, but also in this part in China. But you can also see, as I've labeled, there's quite a bit of uncertainty here. We can also do the same for other variables. So this is the same, but for precipitation in Europe. And you can see again, there's quite a big difference between the scenario with no land use, which is the black one in the background, and especially the blue and the red curve, which the land use estimates from population. So it's having quite a big impact on the precipitation signal there. And also look spatially. So these are maps of the temperature anomaly, so the temperature difference between 6,000 years ago and 200 years ago. In the top left, it's the no land use scenario. The slight is just showing you where it's estimated to be a significant difference. The Hyde, so it's the same thing, but with Hyde, the low intensity land use. The KK10, the high intensity, and the reveals is the pollen based. And what you can see in all of those is that the land use, the sort of main signal really is that it instead of having a kind of cooler Europe 6,000 years ago, we end up in the annual mean with a warmer Europe, especially in this KK10. So potentially it reverses the sign of change. And I think regionally could contribute to some of this disagreement about whether the Holocene was a cooling mode or a warming mode in terms of the annual mean temperatures. We can compare that with some data. So these are 3 different reconstructions of the climate at this time period from fossil pollen, speleothems, and other records. They don't particularly agree that well with each other, as you can probably see, but they all do show some evidence for warmer conditions in Europe, which is in agreement with the sort of more intense land use scenario. So I'd argue that there's at least some features of the Holocene. It can only be explained through the human impact of through deforestation. There's one caveat to these results, which is that the KK10 and HIDE, they define what's called disturbed land, which is just classified as grasses and bare soil. The reveals pollen is a bit more complicated. It depends on the species of plants, and it includes grasses and bare soil, but also some shrubs, according to the classification in different regions. And so I've conservatively included shrubs in the open land areas within the reveals scenario. And I think that has made the signals a lot smaller. The shrubs in the model are actually more like small trees. And so I think there's some more work to do on this. So I predict the signal in the reveal simulation, if I redid it without shrubs as an open land, it would look more like this KK10. Okay, so land use change and deforestation, I think, are important drivers of Holocene climate in some regions, not all, especially Europe, possibly elsewhere. There are really divergent estimates of population land use. So the land use from population, from archaeology and pollen they seem to be going in different directions. But I think that especially for Europe, the more intense early clearance seems to be consistent with the archaeological data, with the pollen data, and what we see with the modeling. I think that this implies quite a strong, at least in the summer, modification of the environment in Europe, at least. But we need to do more work to understand these differences. And as I said, there's more work to do with the simulations. So thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Peter. And so for our next talk, we're going to come bang up to date, and we're going to start talking about a very different interaction between human and trees. So John Holmes is going to talk to us about the role of trees in European poetry.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just click this on. Is the pointer and clicker working?
It is working.
Brilliant. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, good, brilliant. Oh, thanks very much. And now for something completely different. So I'm a literature professor, and my connection with BIFoR is primarily through supervising Dion Dobrinsky's PhD on fantasy forests or fantasy fiction and forest ecology. Dion's just done an excellent film on this, which was one of the ones mentioned earlier on. So I encourage you all to have a look at that. This talk kind of comes from some of my meditations on that work, but also its intersection with another PhD student of mine called Amal Al-Rawisan, who's from Saudi Arabia. And she's working on 20th century American poetry and ecology and kind of environmental violence. So there's an intersection that you'll see emerging. I'm going to be talking then about animated trees from Orpheus to the Ents. And I want to start with Treebeard, the Ent, the oldest Ent in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, who encounters 2 of the hobbits, Merry and Pippin, in Fangorn Forest, and is mobilized to essentially destroy the industrial enterprise of the wizard Saruman, and with it his war machine and his impulse towards deforestation. This is a picture of Treebeard from the films, and this is Pippin's description of Treebeard's eyes, which is where I'm going to start. One felt as if there was an enormous well behind them, filled up with ages of memory and long, slow, steady thinking, but their surface was sparkling with the present, like sun shimmering on the outer leaves of a vast tree or on the ripples of a very deep, deep lake. I don't know, but it felt as if something that grew in the ground, asleep, you might say, or just feeling itself as something between root tip and leaf tip, between deep earth and sky, had suddenly waked up and was considering you with the same slow care that it had given to its own inside affairs for endless years. The reason I wanted to start with Treebeard's eyes is this notion of memory, which we've already heard about in as well as talk in terms of the plant memory, the epigenetic memory of the past. And Treebeard has that deep memory of changing ecologies, of deforestation, and so forth. But I also want to suggest to you that there's a cultural memory that lingers behind this image and behind the creation of the Ents. Tolkien, as you probably know, was not only a writer of fantasy fiction, he was a medieval scholar. He was a medievalist at Oxford University. So where in his extensive library might he have come across a model for thinking about animated trees, these humanoid trees that have a role that includes the role of kind of retributive violence? I think one key source for this is this ancient, well, medieval Welsh manuscript. It's called the Book of Taliesin. That's the only, that is the manuscript itself. That's the cover of the manuscript itself from the National Library of Wales. And there's a poem in the Book of Taliesin, which was written, the manuscript was copied in the 14th century. The poem probably dates to about the 12th century, called The Battle of the Scrub or the Battle of the Trees, or Cad Godw. This is just a fragment from it, but you'll hear, I think, in this description, an anticipation, if you know The Lord of the Rings, either the films or the book, of the Ents. Now the alders at the head of the line thrust forward, the first in time. The willows and mountain ash were late joining the army. The yew is to the fore at the seat of war. The ash was exalted most before the sovereign power. The elm, despite vast numbers, swerved never a foot, but fell on the